Good afternoon and welcome. I am Allison Sutton, the program manager with the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, a Chicago-based association of libraries, universities, museums, community arts organizations, and other archival institutions, founded in 2006, right here on the University of Chicago campus by Professor Danielle Allen and other faculty members then joined in and helped her to plan and build the BMRC, which is now a consortium of 22 members across the Chicago metro area and beyond, and we're growing. The BMRC's mission is to connect all who seek to document, share, understand, and preserve Black experiences. In my role with the consortium, I oversee our primary educational initiatives. One of them is the Summer Short-Term Fellowship, a program that has attracted scholars, writers, and artists from all over the country and other parts of the world since 2009, our first year of the program. And since then, we have hosted 100 or over 100 fellows each summer for a 1-month research residency. So after spending time immersed in the archives, conducting research at usually 2 or more of our BMRC member institutions, it is customary that they share their work in a presentation. So today we will hear from one of our 2022 fellows, Peter Kent-Stoll. Peter is a sociologist who studies racism and colonialism and how they intersect through state policies and the production of urban space. His dissertation, Imperial Metropolis, Settler Colonialism and Anti-Blackness in Chicago, 1952 to 1972, examines how the Bureau of Indian Affairs Relocation Program and Urban Renewal in Chicago shaped the racialization and colonialization of urban space in Chicago. His recent theoretical paper, The Racial and Colonial Dimensions of Gentrification, was published in Sociology Compass. The title of Peter's presentation today is The Settler, Colonial, and Anti-Black Foundations of Urban Renewal in Chicago. Before Peter begins, I want to let our audience know that we have invited a discussant to lead the conversation and Q&A, which will follow Peter's presentation. I will introduce our discussant at that time. Audience members will have opportunities to ask questions as well. So Peter, I am going to stop sharing my screen so that you may share yours.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Allison, for the introduction. Just let me know if anybody cannot see. Yes, and again, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Dr. Fong for willing to serve as a discussant.
Peter, you may want to turn your microphone up. I'm sorry, just a little bit.
Absolutely. And I can just switch microphones out if I need to. Is that a little bit better?
Yeah, that's a little better. Thank you.
Okay. If it does quiet at all, I have a backup mic I can switch over to during the presentation that I have here. So again, thank you, Allison, for the introduction. Thank you to the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. It was a pleasure being a fellow this summer and having the opportunity to be, in the archives for a sustained period of time. The research I'm presenting today, these represent preliminary findings from the research I conducted as a fellow in this project, that the specific case I'll build on today is part of my larger dissertation research. So I'll sort of give a short introduction to my larger research trajectory at the dissertation level before I then zoom into my work as a fellow, just so for those of you I'm meeting for the first time, have a little bit more of an idea of the trajectory of the larger research project. So my dissertation builds on work in critical sociology, Black studies, and Indigenous studies, as well as settler colonial studies, and how these fields are increasingly trying to grapple with the questions of how to develop a framework that can account for the overlapping but also different histories of racial slavery, anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, indigenous dispossession, and how these structures are foundational to both past and present social structures and political formations. In my dissertation in sociology, I revisit mid-20th century Chicago, a site that may already seem as a well-trodden over site, at least by urban sociologists, as the city came to be known as a quote-unquote laboratory for the study of race relations and inequality. However, I revisit the site with the theoretical lenses of anti-blackness and settler colonialism, the latter which has seldom been brought into dialogue when considering how modern regimes of property and racial exclusion developed in Chicago. Along those lines, my dissertation research examines both urban renewal as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs Urban Relocation project, which took place in Chicago, among other cities, during the same time as urban renewal policies. My larger research questions are as follows. How was Chicago's urban space shaped through the intersection of urban renewal and the Bureau of Indian Affairs Urban Relocation program policies in the 1950s through early 1970s? What role did each of these state projects play in differentially racializing and colonizing urban space? And how were these projects shaped by one another, and in what ways did these projects differentially racialize Native and Black people? And lastly, how were these projects articulated within post-war imperial policy and empire building? So in terms of urban renewal, there's three cases that I will focus on for the dissertation. The Lake Meadows project in Bronzeville, Fort Dearborn along the loop / near north side in the Uptown neighborhood in the north side. Today, I will focus specifically just on the first case, Lake Meadows, since this was the earliest of these redevelopment projects and actually named redevelopment project #1 by the city of Chicago, and which set the tone for the logics of urban renewal and dispossession in the post-war era in Chicago and beyond. So here's a brief overview of what I'll be discussing today. I'll first just give a sort of a larger review, very briefly, of the historical patterns of urban renewal and urban relocation, drawn on the literature that focuses on Chicago and beyond. I'll discuss my theoretical framework that grapples with the relationality of anti-blackness and settler colonialism. Then I'll briefly discuss my preliminary findings from my work as a fellow this summer, and then we'll move to a discussion and reflection. So urban renewal took place roughly between 1949 to 1974, which is when the bulk of these large redevelopment projects took place. It could be summarized as a federally sponsored project designed to promote white middle-class homeownership and consumption. Though urban renewal projects varied in their form and scope, they could be defined by sharing the following core features and patterns: so-called slum clearance through mass demolitions, strategies of containing and segregating communities of color, in particular Black communities, through these redevelopment projects, and reshaping downtown areas in order to promote white middle-class consumption and increase property values. The negative impacts of urban renewal disproportionately targeted Black neighborhoods. To highlight just a few particularly jarring findings that really highlight this trend, 406,000 out of 609,000 people displaced by 1963 were African American, and 1,600 out of 2,500 neighborhoods destroyed by 1963 were Black neighborhoods. And in Chicago alone, by 1966, 64% of an estimated 22,950 families displaced were families of color. The segregation and slum shifting tactics of urban renewal are depicted in urban sociology as the dominant racial urban project of this post-war era, but this narrative leaves out specifically the urban relocation project that had very large impacts on Native communities in the cities and beyond. So to give a brief highlight, to introduce those unfamiliar with this history, the Bureau of Indian Affairs began its voluntary relocation program in 1952. Due to racial discrimination in the housing market, limited resources for housing placement, and most job training and job placement programs focused on low-wage work, this program, which focused on bringing Indigenous people from reservation lands to the city, oftentimes they found themselves living in poor and substandard housing after being relocated. termination, which was a series of policies and strategies designed to get the federal government out of the so-called Indian business, as they described it, through the elimination of federal trust restrictions on indigenous lands and nations, and pushing indigenous people off their homelands and towards the city. This served as the ideological backbone of relocation policy. Field offices opened up in many cities, but Chicago and LA were the two largest, had the two largest relocation centers. And overall, across all cities, approximately 155,000 Native people participated in the program. And in Chicago specifically, a settler city located within the territories of the Three Fires people, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, they saw the second largest number of Native people going on relocation after LA. Nearly 5,000 specifically between 1952 and 1959. Most participants for Chicago relocation traveled from the upper Midwest and Great Plains and were Ojibwe and Oceti Sakowin. So in order to understand the emergence of and similarities of the differences and overlaps of the trajectories of urban renewal and urban relocation, I consider how these cases can be understood within a framework of the relationality of settler colonialism and anti-Blackness to understand their intersections, as well as the racial and colonial production of urban space. So I engage with a relational understanding of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism that moves past assumptions of incommensurability, where either anti-Blackness or settler colonialism are assumed as a primary contradiction in the last instance. So drawing on Stuart Hall's approach of articulation, where he insists on understanding how different elements of the social structure come together, but in variable ways that cannot be determined a priori, I analyze settler colonialism and anti-Blackness as foundational structures of racial colonial capitalism, but that don't relate to one another in one specific or predictable way, but articulate depending on their internal contradictions, as well as the contradictions and crises of racial colonial capitalism. Drawing on a framework which we could sort of broadly define as the racial and colonial production of urban space, I argue theories within sociology and beyond, which focus on the racial production of urban space and urban renewal, do not develop a deeper analytics of settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, leaving underexamined the underlying logics that explain the commodification and disposability of bodies and lands that drive urban renewal and other major urban policy projects. So in particular, regarding settler colonialism, I follow Coulthard's analysis of settler colonial capitalism, where he understands how accumulation and its regimes of disposability can be understood as foundational to not only the past, but also the ongoing present of racial colonial capitalism, and thus the racial and colonial production of urban space. So as I mentioned in my study of the impacts of urban renewal on Black people in Chicago, the first case I analyzed is the Lake Meadows Urban Redevelopment Project in the Douglas neighborhood of Bronzeville. This was a major residential redevelopment project paired with commercial development, with plans developing in the late 1940s and breaking ground, with residents moving in the early 1950s through mid 1950s. This was developed by the New York Life Insurance Company, but Ferd Kramer of the real estate firm Draper and Kramer, which had managed many of the New York Life Insurance Company's properties in New York City, serving as a board member also as the Michael Reese Hospital and president of Metropolitan Housing Council, would play a major advisory role in terms of developing the plans, propaganda to elicit consent, as well as lobbying for legislation to secure state funding. In fact, the Lake Meadows project is so significant in terms of it being one of the most earliest urban renewal projects. It got underway before the Housing Acts of 1949 and 1954, or at least the initial plans. It was actually kickstarted by the Illinois Blighted Areas and Redevelopment Act of 1947. This gave the authority to the newly formed Chicago Land Clearance Commission to claim and seize lands that contain so-called blighted properties, including the update to the statute actually in 1949, which gave the commission authority to seize tax delinquent so-called dead subdivisions for redevelopment. Ultimately, Lake Meadows, it would receive funding actually from a combination of federal funds, state funds, and also funds from the city slum clearance bond issue that needed support through a referendum. So Lake Meadows, named redevelopment project number 1 by the city of Chicago, was envisioned by political and business elites as the foundation for future redevelopment projects in the city. A group of major organizations and agencies gathered actually in 1952 from the Commercial Club of Chicago, Chicago Association of Commerce and Industry, Chicago Metropolitan Home Builders Association, Chicago Real Estate Board, Metropolitan Housing and Planning Council, and the South Side Planning Board, inviting the public to a luncheon in order for them to have access to what they described as a story of the greatest forward steps taken by our city in many years, end quote. The Lake Meadows project would displace a staggering 3,416 families of color and not a single white family from the Douglas neighborhood. This displacement was carried out through the state-sanctioned power of eminent domain to seize over 100 acres of land. By 1970, after all the major developments had finished, the neighborhood's Black population had decreased from 78,000, so 97% of the neighborhood, to all the way down to 43,705, or 86% of the neighborhood. And to zoom in on both the racial and class dynamics of these numbers further, according to architectural scholar Reinberger, Lake Meadows displaced 3,500 families, and only about 900 of them found new homes in public housing or in the project itself. So the findings I will now discuss draw mainly from the Kramer papers at University of Chicago, which I accessed as a BMRC fellow. I was also in the Fort Dearborn records, which is another case, so I won't be discussing those today. I do also briefly touch upon images and findings from the Gruen papers at DePaul, the Cherry Lockett papers at Carter Woodson Regional, and the Metropolitan Housing and Planning Council papers at University of Illinois, Chicago. So aggressive advocates of slum clearance and private-led redevelopment, which saw Lake Meadows as the foundation for these policies, such as the Metropolitan Housing Planning Council, which was an organization of business and political elites who aimed to set housing policy for Chicago. They targeted the most poor and hyper-exploited neighborhoods through propaganda and policy as internal enemies that threatened the future of Chicago and its potential of emerging as a modern imperial city after World War II. Slums were targeted as the cause of the post-war housing crisis rather than a symptom of systems of brutal forms of exclusion and exploitation under colonial racial capitalism. They were described as internal enemies of the home front, akin to enemies on the battlefield, which should be shown no mercy. These spaces were described by slum clearance advocates as infecting the health of the city and needing to be cut out like a cancer to save the life of the city. Slum clearance advocates argued that only an aggressive private-led program of redevelopment could convince middle and upper class residents and major businesses to stay and return to the city. And so, for example, Ferd Kramer expressed concern that slum conditions would continue to scare away major investors and Chicago would fall behind other cities if they did not develop a comprehensive plan for slum clearance and slum prevention. And this is a common theme. He, alongside the Metropolitan Housing Planning Council, reiterates in speeches and in promotional materials during this time period. For one example, after citing the Baltimore plan as an example to strive towards, Kramer made his case for a comprehensive plan at the annual meeting of the Southside Planning Board in 1951. Within this plan, Kramer argued that all the major city agencies and boards could coordinate their action with the Chicago Land Clearance Commission, while the Land Clearance Commission would take an aggressive leading role, making large-scale plans and moving quickly toward land acquisition and redevelopment, even when relocation for families living in these spaces had not been secured or guaranteed. Kramer then warned that Chicago was falling behind other cities when it comes to redevelopment and slum clearance, and was gaining a reputation for, quote, slums, a high crime rate, and a great shortage of housing, end quote, which would deter major industries. Then, in the very end of this speech, Kramer describes what would happen if Chicago does not engage in a large-scale slum clearance and development plan. Quote, either nature can be permitted to take its course, evacuating our city of population and industry, or bold measures which will hurt some people and inconvenience others will have to go in and save the city, end quote. Kramer then refers to Chicago from a speech from Walter Moody of the Chicago Plan Commission in 1911, describing Chicago as, quote, destined to become a center of the modern world if opportunities within her reach are intelligently realized, end quote. Kramer then ends this by saying, quote, there are no namby-pamby promises that will do this job. Either the opportunity and the gigantic investment which we already have are worth saving, or we may as well change the spelling back to Chicago, which means wild onion, and give our city back to the Indians, end quote. So Kramer's call to develop a large-scale slum clearance project draws on settler colonial anxieties here that equate Indianness as a threat to civilization and progress and the future of Chicago becoming the center of the modern world. I argue in this instance that the imaginary of the indigenous subject underscores key aspects of how the clearance of land takes place and how the settler state and city seeks to deny indigenous sovereignty while also constructing Black spaces as a threat to progress and civilization. According to Kramer, the maximization of fungible land required that indigenous people are rendered as already in the past, and poor and working class Black city spaces are reduced to discourses of blight, criminality, and disease to be eliminated in order to attract competitive investment. So while political and business elites by this time, by the early 1950s, have been speaking confidently about plans for Lake Meadows, political struggles over funding and housing had immediately preceded this moment. Local funding required the passage of bond measures in Chicago, which provided funds to be matched at the Illinois state level. The Metropolitan Housing Council played a key role in garnering support from the press, labor unions, and neighborhood organizations to gain overwhelming support and build a pact or a consensus for slum clearance across these different sectors. But despite these coordinated efforts to build support from slum clearance among labor unions, community organizations, and businesses, the plan for Lake Meadows would still face a major challenge through the introduction of Third Ward Alderman Carey's ordinance, or named after him, the Carey Ordinance, which aimed to ban discrimination in housing and in buildings built on land acquired by the Chicago Land Clearance Commission. It was this latter component of the proposed bill that specifically bristled the Lake Meadows development team. In a set of remarks made before the Housing Committee of City Council on February 1st, 1949, Kramer made his case against the Carey Ordinance, describing how both private and public housing was included in the mayor's supposed enlightened housing plan, claiming the Carey Ordinance would force the city to lose its competitive edge, losing out on investors who would instead decide to invest in vacant land outside the city or on the city's outskirts. Trying to qualify this vicious opposition to an anti-discrimination ordinance, Kramer boasted that he and his firm were rare in that they rented to and employed non-white people without being forced by law. He then praised the proposed Lake Meadows plans of building integrated private rentals as leading the way in the city and the nation in this regard. But with this said, he clarified that developers of the project will need to maintain their power to decide exactly what type of tenants they will allow to move in, quote, only the highest grade tenants, end quote, and allowing property managers to exclude, claiming that, quote, the only way a mixed project has any chance of success is through a very careful tenant selection policy, end quote. And that property managers should have the power to exclude an applicant if, quote, the management feels that he would not fit in very well with the rest of the tenants. If this power was not given, he claimed developers and real estate managers would be overburdened with discrimination claims and the plan will become unworkable. So in this self-contradicting argument, Kramer opposes the anti-discrimination law because he claims it would get in the way of integration, albeit on developers' own terms and with the racial and class balance of their own choosing. Indeed, after the initial completion of Lake Meadows construction, the progress reports and brochures highlighted the professional and white-collar status of new residents, bragging that new residents consisted of people with professional occupations such as professors, scientists, hospital supervisors, social workers, and dentists. So Kramer's speech highlights the goals of private developers of Lake Meadows project and the slum clearance plan overall. Integration could be tolerated or even promoted, but only on capitalists' own terms in order to maintain the property developers and managers' right to discriminate based on race. Thinly and hypocritically veiled is actually supporting integration. Moreover, Kramer describes large-scale public housing as impractical and an existential threat to real estate capitalists. He further aimed to degrade support for the ordinance by painting pictures of its supporters as combinations of well-meaning, high-minded idealists and also those supposedly secretly supporting the ordinance in order to continue to profit from the slums. He ends by arguing the ultimate power over housing decisions should not lie in the supposedly cumbersome and risky anti-discrimination ordinance, but rather in the hands of the Chicago Land Clearance Commission and City Council. The endorsement of the Land Clearance Commission is significant here, as this agency was created within the city as a counterweight to diminish the possibility of a more robust public housing program. with vicious opposition to the Cary Ordinance also coming from Mayor Kennelly, who claimed the Cary Ordinance would, quote, retard if not completely prevent the rebuilding of Chicago slums, end quote. The ordinance was defeated by City Council in March of 1949 by a vote of 31-13. With this emerging consensus of slum clearance and subsidizing private development, the framework was set up for urban renewal to move full speed ahead, for Lake Meadows to receive full support from City Council and the mayor, putting the fate of a more robust public housing program where housing would be prioritized as a human right in deep peril. So here I want to conclude with this brief discussion of key themes from my preliminary findings by just beginning to explore what are the connections we might be seeing here between anti-Blackness and settler colonialism. So first, we can see connections between settler colonialism and anti-Blackness through the ruling class seeking to make land more fungible, a fundamental logic and technique of the settler state, which operates to continue to deny indigenous sovereignty and Black spatiality. In the case of slum clearance, developers called upon the state to use the power of eminent domain to carry out this strategy through the Land Clearance Commission. The connections between settler colonialism are obvious in the process itself of making the land more fungible and bleed through in the anxieties expressed by Kramer and others, in which Kramer describes how slums inhabited by poor and working class Black people will supposedly destroy the future of the city if bold action is not taken. And the land, quote, may as well be returned to indigenous people if that action is not taken. Black city spaces are described as a threat to the settler project, and the ruling class's ability to maintain the settler colonial project is measured in this case by its ability to manage and control Black spaces. What is the connection? So what is the connection to this in the Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation program, which we'll really just briefly touch on today, but I'll still be thinking about how I can build on this in the future and in future chapters of the dissertation. As I will describe in later chapters on relocation, BIA officials describe reservation lands as not rationalized enough and in need of being assessed for taxes, similar to how the ruling class in cities describe slums as a supposed problem or quote unquote dead subdivisions, draining the city's resources rather than being a symptom of hyperexploitation and dispossession. So in both cases, the reservation and the slum are treated as internal enemies that pose an existential threat to the US emerging as a modern empire and world power after World War II. And lastly, as I will touch on in the following chapters, the Lake Meadows project set in place of Logic's urban renewal projects, privileging exclusionary tactics, rapid land seizures, and private redevelopment over housing poor and working class people, further worsening the housing crisis that would also impact indigenous people as they move to the city in large numbers through the relocation project, just as Lake Meadows was breaking ground. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm very much looking forward to your questions and dialogue. I just want to give a special thanks to Venus Green, to Moon Ki Jung, Cedric De Leon, to Allison Sutton, to Sarah Fong, and also Marlik McMacken, and also just briefly acknowledge funding from a couple other sources that were briefly referenced here from the UMass Graduate School and American Sociological Association. Thank you, everybody, once again. I'm looking forward to the dialogue.
Thank you, Peter. So we will move now to the conversation and discussion period. So we have invited a facilitator and discussant. Sarah E.K. Fong is a professor and assistant professor of studies in race, colonialism, and diaspora at Tufts University. Her current book project, The Character of Capitalism, Race-Making and Settler Colonialism in 19th Century Industrial Boarding Schools, examines the entanglements of schooling, self-making, and racial settler capitalism in the late 19th century. Her work has been published in American Indian Culture and Research Journal, Postmodern Culture, and Amerasia Journal. Professor Fong, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Allison. And thank you, Peter, for that really interesting talk. It's great to see you here again today. Peter and I connected a couple of years ago. I think it was a few years ago. We were just talking about how it's hard to sort of tell what was yesterday and what was 3 years ago at this point. But this is part of a continuing conversation that Peter and I have had about the connections and in our work and the sort of areas of mutual interest in both of our research. So I'm very honored to be here today and look forward to facilitating a discussion with those of you who are in attendance. I'll just make a couple of remarks, sort of pulling out some strands that I think really stand out from Peter's work. And I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask. But I would also really encourage those of you who are here today to ask questions that you have. So if you want to put them in the chat, you can do that. You're also free to raise a hand or just speak up when the time comes. I think we're a decently sized group where we can sort of manage just having a conversation for those who want to participate. So I'm interested in the way that Peter's project asks, the larger dissertation project asks how urban renewal and urban relocation help to produce racial and colonial spatial orders. And one of the things that I think is important to consider here is also, right, this is a project about space and about land, but I'm thinking also about the management and control of bodies within space, right, and what it means to produce racially and colonially ordered space through this sort of management of how Black and Indigenous bodies move through space, right? And so this is something I think that we could talk a little bit more about in the discussion portion. Peter complicates, as he says in the sort of start of his presentation, the prevailing analysis of post-war urban policy as a set of policies that's rooted in racial segregation or racial exclusion. Peter's asking also how dispossession and assimilation function as part of this sort of policy milieu at this moment in time. And I think that this is a really important question to ask to sort of complicate the analytics and frameworks that we use to understand how racial and colonial power works, right? It's not always only about exclusion, but also about managed inclusion, or it can be. So this particular piece of the project that Peter presented us with today focuses on the Lake Meadows redevelopment project to think about how space is racially ordered and how that racial ordering is connected to the underlying settler logics of space, and I would say of sort of embodied management and control. Peter attunes us to the efforts that it takes to make land fungible and to extract value from land by managing the presence and movement of racialized bodies within space. Let's see. I think one of the things, Peter, that really is interesting to me in the way that you're framing this is the way that the dispossession of Black and Indigenous people, the removal and relocation of Black and Indigenous people is presented as necessary to create the modern urban city. And I'm curious to hear more about what you think about, or what you're finding in the archives about what modernity means to those who are sort of using that framework, right? What is it about the city of Chicago that makes it modern, or that requires the sort of removal and relocation of Black and Native people in order to become modern? What does modernity mean in this case? So I want to just start with one question to sort of pick up on one of these points. You mentioned throughout your paper, throughout your presentation, questions about investors, whether or not investors will be disinclined to invest because of the presence of Black communities. And by virtue of that, I think we're also talking about property value, right? And I think you do name that explicitly in some places. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how you see anti-Blackness and settler colonialism relating to the production of value and the extraction of value from both land and from Black and Indigenous people. It didn't come up as much in the paper today, but I know, you've mentioned elsewhere that with the urban relocation program, a lot of the Indigenous people who were coming into the city were sort of rooted into a stratified labor market, right? And I presume that's the case also for Black Chicagoans, right? So I'm curious how you see anti-Blackness and settler colonialism relating to the production of value and the extraction of value from both land and the embodied labor of Black and Indigenous people.
Wonderful. Should I jump? So I can jump in now. Does it sound good?
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you, Dr. Fong, for these really insightful comments and elaborations to continue to think about these questions, especially, the theoretical and historical questions about how we see the intersections between settler colonialism and anti-Blackness. Regarding, I especially like, and I think maybe I should even emphasize that a little bit more in future drafts, but I like how you termed, I liked how you emphasize and manage inclusion. And we definitely do see that in different ways, but there are some intersections there in terms of thinking about the assimilatory logics of the urban relocation program as a type of managed inclusion. And as Lake Meadows as well, although not to analogize or think that is the same type of project, but to think about that theme of managed inclusion taking place with Lake Meadows perhaps as well. And especially in terms of the speech I was sharing from Ferda Kramer, in terms of how he was describing how they sort of imagine what they imagine sort of their own managed form of integration to look like, right? Yes, and then in terms of the question about the production and extraction of value, I think that's definitely something I can flesh out more. And I think I mentioned Coulthard, but I think I can go back to him and engage with him in more depth. And then also thinking about engaging with other frameworks of colonial and racial capitalism, such as from Du Bois or from Cedric Robinson. But yeah, so in terms of the extraction of value, so for one, I'm thinking about, and I sort of briefly touch on it, and I think that gets at the question of sort of making land fungible in order to, produce value, in order to go to investors or to market it to them, saying, there's also, well, let me actually just provide one more detail that I didn't get a chance to touch upon. But another key aspect, in addition to eminent domain, is this idea of the write-down formula. And basically what happens is, you have the Chicago Land Clearance Commission, which forms, right? And they sort of are serving as a counterweight to prioritize private redevelopment, to always sort of dampen the possibility of there being a larger program to really house the masses of poor and working class people. But so what happens is they will they seize land, right? Either through eminent domain, through tax delinquency, and then there's a write down formula basically where the land, it's the value of it gets. They're saying that, well, it was these quote unquote slum lands were overvalued, so now we actually need to sell it for cheaper. We need to actually adjust the price and then sell it for cheaper to investors, right? So I think and then another aspect of that is there are, which I'm going to get into more as I continue to dig into this research, but there is a relocation aspect to it, right? But of course the relocation isn't saying people living in the Douglas neighborhood, they can all be relocated into this new housing, right? We'll find public housing, or we might find other housing for you, even though they do a really poor job of actually informing people of their rights, which was actually written into the Illinois law. But anyway, to get to the point here about extraction of value. So yeah, they write down the formula, and then they have a write down formula. Then they go to investors in order to attract them and say, well, yeah, we can get this land, we can get it cheap, and then we'll sell it back to you. So basically, sort of providing a subsidy for private development, right? And then the parallel with the parallel process of dispossession taking place, that's also driving urban relocation, is the termination policy. So you see within the city, you see a move towards seizing lands quickly, specifically within Black working class spaces, and then on reservations as well, which I touch on at the end. The push for relocation, it sort of provides a justification to move in and to remove trust restrictions. And again, so you see that fungibility of saying, well, no, this is unproductive. These federal trust restrictions are getting in the way of capitalist development. They're getting in the way of us boosting our post-war economy. And we need access to this space. We need access to this land now. So I don't know if that, I think I need to work through this more, but I think those processes, thinking about the write down formula and thinking about termination is how I'm thinking about it now. And then of course, and then as people are becoming more vulnerable, right, that also further reproduces, as you mentioned, the segmented and racially discriminatory labor market as well.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Peter. And I'll make one comment just as that came up for me as I was listening to you talk, and then see if others have questions. But I wonder if there's something there to think about in terms of capitalism's need for surplus populations, and how that is also a spatial question, right? Where do we house? Where do people who make up these surplus populations live, right? And spend their days and their working hours and non-working hours. So I'm thinking about, as you're talking, I'm sort of envisioning this constant movement of Black and Indigenous peoples to different spaces based on, where surplus populations need to be sort of contained, right? So we have, unemployed, underemployed, underpaid, workers, living in, what are, termed the slums. When that land then becomes part of a plan for increasing the value of the land, right, that surplus population has to be moved somewhere else. I think you have a sort of parallel process going on with relocation and wanting to move Indigenous peoples off of reservations, right? This is also, could be understood as another sort of surplus population that needs to be moved in order to reconnect or insert them into the circuits of capitalism, and to make both the embodied labor of Indigenous people and their land, assets for and productive for capitalism. So I just wonder there if there's something to think about surplus labor as a necessity for racial and settler capitalism, and what that has to do with space and placement. I think there might be something there to think about. So I have other questions that I could ask, but I would love actually to open up to others to see what questions you all have. And of course I can fill in if there aren't, but I imagine there are. So if you want to put questions in the chat or raise a hand in Zoom, or just, oops, you muted myself, or just go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question, please feel free to do so. Let's make this a conversation with others as well.
I have a question. I think that, Peter, you mentioned over 3,000 Black families were displaced with the clearance that occurred before Lake Meadows could be built. And some of them did not find housing. I may have missed it. I hope I didn't, but do you know, in your research, were there other kinds of resources? I mean, I just kept thinking, well, wow, what happened? It's one thing it's huge to be displaced, but then to find a place, at least you, I guess, sort of pick up your life and try to resettle, but to not, that really just struck me, and I kept thinking about it. And I didn't know if you came across any other sort of really detailed information about that.
Yes, thank you, Allison. And I'm really glad you asked that question, because I did start to come across some information, and I guess perhaps unsurprisingly, because that was not the priority of the development, right? I feel like it's going to be a more involved process where I'm sort of having to follow up on different threads. So one of the locations was the Dearborn homes. And so, you did have those numbers where some families were able to find where some families were able to find housing and public housing nearby. And yes, it's hard. So I'm still struggling to find the exact numbers in terms of where everyone went, because I'm hopeful I'll be able to find more, but I'm not sure if I will get to a final answer on all the breakdown, right? Because so like what happens is so I was looking at a report from 1951 from the Chicago Land Clearance Commission, which is where some of those numbers are coming from, saying, we've this many families, like a small, not a majority of families, basically, we've, been able to help relocate, right? And then once the Department of Urban Renewal gets formed, they start to consolidate numbers from people displaced from other projects, and you keep on seeing, like, each year in the tabulations, there's always many families who are still, they'll still say, well, this many families are still yet to be relocated, or we just don't know, right? And I think one more sort of thread, again, not giving me the final answer yet, but one more thread on this is, I came across a letter, basically, from one of the agencies that was managing the Redevelopment Act, which also included a policy about relocation. And it was pretty scathing. It was criticizing the Land Clearance Commission, basically saying, well, you're actually really not following the statute, because you're supposed to be, part of the statute is not just to provide relocation options, but you're supposed to be going to families, and you're supposed to be actually notifying them of their rights for relocation, which you're not doing, right? And by that point, the displacement's already taken place and you haven't done it. So yes, unfortunately, I have those threads, but which I also think are indicating a lot about, what's being prioritized as well, right?
Thank you, Peter. We have a question in the chat from Marcia. Marcia asks, Peter, you focused on Lake Meadows today, but also listed Fort Dearborn and Uptown as areas of interest for your research. How do you envision those communities factoring into your study of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism?
Thank you, Marcia. These are great questions. And I think, so for Fort Dearborn, this starts to take shape. This starts to take shape actually, like, right as Lake Meadows is breaking ground at 53, 54. It has some of the same actors, such as people from Marshall Field and Company, Earl Cribben, who was also a major planner, or sort of played a key role, at least, in Lake Meadows, and actually in terms of lobbying for legislation for slum clearance. So far, I decided to focus on Fort Dearborn because first of all, it sort of is seen as like the center. It's seen as taking place in the loop, so it's getting, maybe it'll get at the questions that Dr. Fong had asked in terms of like how modernity is being imagined, because they sort of imagine this after Lake Meadows as being sort of this anchor of them rebuilding like state properties and they have sort of being this, what will be like the center of this continued redevelopment. It also takes place right in terms of what's imagined as like the first white settlement of Chicago. So there's a dimension of sort of the symbolic or cultural dimension that I want to dig into there as well, in terms of like the site of Fort Dearborn, and how they actually sort of have this resuscitation of like settler imaginaries and settler versions of history that are sort of celebrating Fort Dearborn. I think many times they'll even sort of call it they'll sort of like say it's the rebirth of Fort Dearborn. So like they're imagining the rebirth of Chicago taking place directly at this site of what's seen as like the original site of white settlement. And I think they even call it the new Fort Dearborn in some of their promotional materials. And then I look at Uptown because that's the neighborhood that had the largest population of Native people migrating from relocation and also outside of relocation. So I definitely want to focus on Uptown. And it also sort of overlaps with Urban Renewal here, because in terms of the chronology, as Urban Renewal starts to receive, the consensus starts to break down, there's a lot of sort of pitched battles over redevelopment in the mid 1960s at Uptown. So yes, so that's why I want to focus on those cases specifically.
That's great. Thank you, Peter. Other questions, comments? Okay, we have a question here from Stephen in the chat. Stephen asks, I'm wondering if you have a personal relationship with this topic which sparked your interest and curiosity. So how did you come to this project?
Yes, so I'd say it's a personal and political interest in terms of friends, colleagues, comrades being impacted by these policies, specifically more so urban renewal and gentrification. And I'd say the settler colonial aspect of it, I think that's it'll hopefully become the settler colonial aspect of it, that's of course personal in terms of all of us all being within it, but also it's been political in terms of conversations I've had with mentors, with colleagues, with people I'm in political dialogue with in terms of thinking about this question. And I think it's coming up a lot more within progressive circles, and I think within academia more as well. In terms of, I think it's a big difference from it was 20 years ago, but really starting to think seriously about these questions, about the Indigenous question, and about how really it's central and it's overlapping with all these other political questions and contradictions, right? And trying to, as best as possible, to think about this, in any type of major political struggle, right? Whether that's, and it's pushing back against this idea of, there's sort of the dominant framework of like Indigenous struggles are in rural spaces, right? And within the city, like it's not as applicable, right? So sort of following different organizations that are trying to grapple with thinking about both of these questions together. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Peter. We have another question here from Andre, which is, I'm very interested in your illumination of the language of policy in which the investors dictate the terms of social organization, integration, racial caste. Will you be able to bring in other examples of how this language is used by current elected officials, lobbyists, and interest groups?
Oh, yes, I really like this question. Thank you, Andre. I definitely want to do this. Yes, absolutely. I think like for the dissertation, I could do it in the introduction or sort of the epilogue. Yeah, but absolutely, because I think that, because I want to think about how this is, this is a key moment that's setting up sort of these the racial and colonial logics of exclusion and dispossession. But I also want to think about how this is still taking place in the present, right? So I had been working a couple of years ago thinking about gentrification projects and thinking about this question with with late 20th century, early 21st century gentrification projects. Yes, but I feel like I'm rusty on that work now, but I definitely want to bring that in, like whether it's the introduction, whether it's the conclusion, because I think that's a great way to show those threads and to show those connections, how they're still very present, how they're still very present today, right? Yeah, and I was just thinking about what Dr. Fong was saying about, these discourses of management, and one that you see, and you of course see this today as well, is like how central the discourse of criminology or criminological discourses, right, play into these calls to manage Black city spaces or Indigenous spaces, right, and how these are used as excuses or legitimations to come in, right, and to carry out these large scale displacements. So yes, I'll definitely be thinking about this more.
Thanks, Peter.
Oh,
Marcia has a comment here, which I'll read. I'm sure you all can see it. But as Uptown is a community experiencing a lot of gentrification and displacement today, it could be a case study for connections between urban renewal and modern gentrification. Yeah, that's great for thinking, across these historical periods and how these logics continue to inform policy and discourse today, and ground that in a particular example that Marcia's bringing forward.
Yes, that's a great That's a great point. I think that would be, yeah, that would actually be, that could actually even be a good opportunity to think about like some type of epilogue. Yes, to think about the present moment. Yeah, and I know that the American Indian Center, which was founded during relocation, I think they actually had to relocate to Albany Park because of some of those forces of gentrification and displacement as well. So yes, I'll definitely be thinking about that question more as well.
Peter, I wanted to just add a thought that came to me as you were just talking about the sort of language of criminality. I think that that's one way to maybe think about the connections between, you know, the racialization of bodies and the production of value, or, you know, detraction from value, right? So I think there is something there about the way that particular bodies, in your case, Black and Indigenous bodies, are racialized or portrayed as criminal, as deviant, as outside of, you know, sort of the realm of modern, productive, respectable citizenship, and their presence in particular places that then sort of moves the needle on the relative value of place, right? The actual like property values and whatnot. So there's something there, I think, that's really interesting for you to maybe keep thinking about, is the sort of nexus of, you know, the racialization of particular bodies, their relationship to and movement through space, and the way that that informs value within sort of the circuits of capitalism.
Yes, yeah, yes, absolutely. And I'll continue to think more about that too. And you see, and I'll bring that in future aspects of the project, but you see that with the Chicago Land Clearance Commission, like when they run they like have periodic reports that they have to produce, sort of basically continuing to justify and legitimate why they're seizing such, you know, such so many acres of land, right? And there's a lot of discourse about delinquency and juvenile delinquency, and Kramer draws upon that as well too. Like he has this one line. You know, I don't even know if it's true or where he's getting it from. And it's probably not true, even if it is a statistic, because of how policing takes place and how the numbers are actually collected, right? But he has this line that he keeps on saying over and over again in all these speeches, where he says, oh, the delinquency rate is 4 times the rest of the city, it's 4 times as high as the rest of the city. So yes, so that's definitely something I can dig into more. I mean, you see it come up with justifications also for why the relocation program needs to take place. There's like delinquency, supposed family dysfunction. These are, you know, we have to do something about this on the reservation. So we have to break up these communally held lands.
Exactly. Peter, thank you so much. My schedule tells me to turn it back over to Allison now.
Thank you, Professor Fong. We appreciate your participation and your sharing your expertise to add to the conversation today. Thank you so much. And Peter, of course, we are cheering you on as you continue your research and work on your dissertation. We have been grateful for your presence and enjoyed having you as a fellow this summer. Please do keep in touch and keep us posted on your continued research. Thank you so very much. I'm going to share my screen. If there's anyone in the audience today who is interested in the BMRC Summer Short-Term Fellowship, I put a QR code here that you can scan to find out more information about the process. And if you have any questions, of course, you can contact me. And others of you who are maybe joining us for the first time, I want to invite you to connect with us across social media and maybe take a look at our website and